Welcome to Fierce Queen's Reckoning. I'm glad you're here. Now, let's get into the story. Marcus Holt drove his brand new gunmetal gray Porsche Cayenne straight to the front entrance of the building. He had just stripped from his ex-wife's name, the building she had spent 11 years of her life designing from the ground up, and he brought his new girlfriend along to watch. He had called it a professional courtesy visit. His lawyer had called it transition management. Diane Holt, who had just legally become Diane Okafor again 3 months prior, called it exactly what it was, the moment she saw the car pull into the lot. A performance. Marcus had always needed an audience. The building was a converted textile warehouse on the east side of Hamilton, Ontario Road. 3 floors of exposed brick and Douglas fir, floor-to-ceiling industrial windows. A freight elevator. Diane had refurbished herself by calling in a favor from a restoration contractor in Burlington. The sign above the loading dock still read Holt Creative Studio in brushed steel letters, because Marcus's lawyers had moved faster than the building manager. Diane had stopped caring about the sign weeks ago. She had other things to occupy her attention. She was in the middle of a phone call when she heard the Porsche. She was standing in what used to be her private studio on the 3rd floor. A long, north-facing room she had chosen specifically for the quality of the gray morning light it pulled in from the lake. When she caught the sound of the car door through the open window, she didn't look down immediately. She finished her sentence on the phone, said goodbye, set the device face down on the drafting table, and then walked to the window and looked. Marcus was 49. He had the posture of a man who had recently started going to a personal trainer and wanted everyone within a 30-meter radius to be aware of that fact. He wore a dark olive performance jacket that was too tight across the shoulders and dark jeans that were too deliberately distressed to have actually seen any real work. He had that particular kind of confidence that men develop when they stop being afraid of their wives and start being afraid of nothing at all, which is a different and much more dangerous thing. The woman who stepped out of the passenger side was named Jessie. Diane knew this because Marcus's assistant had mentioned it twice in a voicemail she wasn't supposed to have heard. Jessie was young, late 20s, maybe 30, in a cropped white puffer coat and ankle boots, with a slight heel that were entirely unsuitable for the icy Hamilton January. She looped her arm through Marcus's immediately, which told Diane everything she needed to know about where Jessie thought she stood in the hierarchy of this situation. Diane watched them take in the building from the lot. She watched Marcus gesture toward the loading dock entrance, with the proprietary sweep of a man who had just bought something he'd always coveted. She watched Jessie say something that made Marcus laugh, and she watched Marcus put his hand briefly on the small of Jessie's back in the way people do when they want to be observed doing it. Then Diane stepped back from the window, picked up her phone, and texted her lawyer 3 words. "They just arrived." Her lawyer texted back too. Perfect timing. Diane put the phone in the pocket of her work trousers. Charcoal wide-leg wool, no label visible, made by a small atelier in Montreal, whose waiting list ran 18 months. And she went downstairs to let them in. She had been expecting this visit for 11 days. She had been preparing for this moment for considerably longer. Tell us what happened in that building on a Tuesday morning in January. You have to understand what the building actually was, and what Marcus had understood it to be, which were 2 entirely different things. Marcus Holt had met Diane in their 2nd year at OCAD in Toronto. She was quieter than the students who got the most attention, which in a fine arts environment is genuinely unusual. But the faculty talked about her work. Her thesis supervisor had used the word structural intuition in a seminar once, and everyone in the room had known who he meant without him saying the name. Diane had an ability, still rare, still not fully explicable, to look at a broken or neglected space and understand not just what it could become, but what it had always been trying to be. Marcus had understood early on that this ability was worth more than his own. He had also understood, with the cold calculus of a certain type of ambitious person, that the most efficient path to leveraging someone else's talent was to marry it. They had built Holt Creative Studio together over 11 years. Diane had built it, and Marcus had built the business around it, which he had always described as the harder job. A claim Diane had eventually stopped arguing with, because the energy required. to argue with Marcus about the value of her own contributions had started to outweigh the return. The studio had started as a residential interior design practice. It had grown into something considerably more complex, a design consultancy that worked with heritage property developers, arts organizations, and municipal governments across Southern Iowa. 3 years ago, Holt Creative had been brought in as lead design consultant on the Lakeview Cultural Corridor, a $340 million provincial redevelopment project that was still, as of that January morning, very much ongoing. The divorce had been ugly in the specific way. Divorces are ugly when one party has a family friend who is also a corporate lawyer and the other party simply wants it to be over. Marcus had kept the studio name, the client relationships, the Hamilton building, and the operating company. Diane had kept her personal design portfolio, a modest severance that Marcus's lawyer had framed as extraordinarily generous, and a small Victorian semi-detached on Aberdeen Avenue that Marcus had not particularly wanted. But Marcus's lawyer had not understood, because Marcus himself had not fully understood, because he had always left the technical documentation to Diane, because he had always considered that kind of detail beneath his particular skill set, was that the Lakeview Cultural Corridor contract had not been signed by Holt Creative Studio Inc. It had been signed by Okafor Design Holdings, a numbered company Diane had registered in her own name in 2019, before the marriage had started its final deterioration and well before any lawyer had been retained by anyone. She had done it quietly, on the advice of a friend who was an accountant, because she had sensed even then that the business structures Marcus preferred were ones where her name appeared in the fine print and his appeared on the door. The Lakeview contract was worth $4.2 million in consulting fees over a 5-year period. The provincial arts endowment attached to it was worth another $800,000, and the IP rights for all design concepts, spatial frameworks, and heritage integration methodologies developed under the contract belonged, legally and without ambiguity, to Okafor Design Holdings. Marcus did not know this. On the morning, he drove to Hamilton to show Jesse around his newly acquired building. He was about to find out. Diane met them at the loading dock entrance. She had not dressed up for this. She was wearing the charcoal trousers, a cream-ribbed turtleneck, and low suede Chelsea boots that had gone soft and dark at the toe, from years of actual use. Her hair was pulled back. She was not wearing much jewelry. She had her reading glasses pushed up on her head, the way she always did when she had been working. She looked, in other words, exactly like herself. Marcus looked at her the way he always had in the final year of the marriage, with a kind of exasperated pity, as though her refusal to perform more visibly was a personal inconvenience to him. "Diane," he said. He didn't extend a hand. "Thanks for making yourself available." "Of course," Diane said. She looked at Jesse. "Hi, I'm Diane." Jesse gave a small, tight smile that did not involve her eyes. "Jesse, Marcus has told me a lot about this place." "I'm sure he has," Diane said pleasantly. She held the door and let them in. The ground floor of the building was in transition. There were moving boxes stacked near the freight elevator, a few bare bulb work lights, the particular cold that accumulates in a building that has been running at partial occupancy. Marcus looked around with the satisfied air of a man cataloging inventory. He pointed out the height of the ceiling to Jesse. He mentioned that the freight elevator had been a significant capital improvement. He did not say who had sourced the contractor or negotiated the restoration cost. He had, in the small cruelties of long marriages, gotten very good at narrating her work in his own voice. Diane let him. She had learned, in the past 2 years, the specific peace that comes from no longer needing to correct the record in real time. They took the stairs to the 3rd floor. Marcus talked the whole way up about his plans for the space, a boutique creative agency he was launching, some rebranding work he had lined up, a contact in Dundas who was interested in co-tenancy. Jesse asked questions in the way someone does when they are performing interest on behalf of someone else. Diane was quiet. She was very good at quiet. Was the room that made people stop talking. It always had. The north windows ran the full width of the building. The original brick had been sandblasted and sealed, and in January, with the pale flat light coming off Lake Ontario, the room held a particular quality of illumination that Diane had spent 8 months engineering. The drafting tables were still set up. The pinboard still held fragments of the Lakeview working documents. A large format print of the Phase 2 Heritage Overlay map was tacked to the east wall. Marcus walked in and stopped. He stood there for a moment, and Diane watched something move across his face. Not quite discomfort, but the beginning of it. His eyes went to the Lakeview materials on the wall. He knew the project. He had sat in the initial pitch meeting. He had shaken hands with the provincial project director and described himself as the studio's creative lead. "You still have the Lakeview files here," he said. There was a slight flatness to the statement. "I do," Diane said. "Those will need to be transferred. The project is transitioning to Holt Creative as of the 1st of February. He said this with the confidence of a man who had a lawyer who had told him it was already done. Diane tilted her head slightly. "Is that what Brian told you?" Marcus's jaw tightened at the mention of his lawyer. "The operating agreement is clear. All active client relationships transfer with the business." "Active client relationships?" "Yes," Diane said. "Again. But the Lakeview contract isn't a client relationship in the sense Brian was referring to." She moved to the drafting table and picked up a manila folder. Not the main folder, just the cover document, the one she had set out that morning for exactly this purpose. She held it out toward Marcus. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it the way people look at things that have begun to make them uneasy. Jessie had gone quiet. She was standing near the windows, looking out at the lake, which was either genuine interest or good social instinct. Marcus took the folder. He opened it. He read the top page. Diane watched his eyes move across the document and then stop, then go back to the beginning, the way people reread things that have not said what they expected. "Okafor Design Holdings," he said slowly. "Registered 2019, Diane confirmed. "I was still Diane Holt at the time, technically. Aiken. The name on the registration is Diane Adeza Okafor Holt, sole director." He looked up. The Lakeview contract was always understood to be a Holt Creative project. "It was understood that way by you," Diane said. "The province of Ontario understood it the way the contract read. Which was the way the contract was written. Which was the way I wrote it." She paused. "You were in Banff that week. Please. You asked me to handle the paperwork." The color in Marcus's face was changing in a way that Diane recognized. She had seen it in mediation, when Brian had presented the asset division, and Marcus had realized Diane wasn't going to fight the way he had prepared to counter. "You're telling me the Lakeview contract belongs to a holding company you registered in your own name," Marcus said carefully. "I'm telling you, the Lakeview contract is currently active, ongoing, and legally owned by Okafor Design Holdings, which is my company," Diane said, "along with all associated design IP, heritage methodology frameworks, and Phase 3 deliverables, which are due to the province in April." "That's..." Marcus stopped himself. He put the folder down on the drafting table. He looked at her. "Diane, that's fraud. You can't sign a contract under a separate entity without disclosing the corporate structure to the client." "I disclosed everything to the client," Diane said, "fully, in writing, during the contracting phase. The province's legal team reviewed the corporate structure of Okafor Design Holdings before they countersigned. They were aware they were contracting with a sole proprietor entity under my name." She watched him absorb this. But what they were not made aware of, because there was nothing to disclose at the time, was that Holt Creative Studio Inc. would later be acquired entirely by you in a divorce settlement. Marcus was breathing differently. Diane noticed it the way she always noticed things. Not with satisfaction, exactly, but with the precise architectural attention she gave to structural load. "Brian will contest this," Marcus said. His voice had gone quieter. The bluster had drained out of it. "He'll say the contract was developed using Holt Creative resources. Studio time, staff, overhead. He's welcome to," Diane said. "My records show that all Lakeview billable hours were logged under the Okafor Holdings account. The province pays Okafor Holdings directly. Holt Creative has never received $1 of Lakeview revenue. Brian can verify this with the government payment records, which are public." There was a silence in the room, filled somewhere below them, in the street. A delivery van was reversing with a beeping that seemed very loud and very far away at the same time. Jessie turned from the window. She looked at Marcus. Her expression was the careful blankness of someone who was doing very rapid math. Marcus pulled out his phone. He stepped away from the drafting table and called Brian. Diane waited. She had expected this too. The call connected after 2 rings. Marcus. Brian's voice was tight even at a distance. Where are you right now? I'm at the studio. With Diane. A pause. She's showing me a contract with something called Okafor Design Holdings. She's telling me Lakeview belongs to a separate entity. The silence on Brian's end was the kind that has information in it. Brian, Marcus said. The confidence in his voice had gone down another register. Tell me she's wrong. I spoke with the province's legal office this morning, Brian said. I was going to call you after I had more information. He stopped. The Lakeview contract is registered to Okafor Design Holdings. It predates the marriage dissolution by 14 months. I've been going through the original vendor documentation, and the incorporated structure is. It's clean, Marcus. There's no ambiguity. Then we challenge the FP. Everything developed in this building, on Holt Creative overhead. The IP clauses attached to the contracting entity, Brian said, which is Okafor Holdings. I've been on the phone with our IP litigator for the past hour. If we go after the Lakeview deliverables, we're looking at 2 to 3 years of federal litigation and a reasonable probability of losing, because the foundational structure of the contract is sound. A pause. There's more. Marcus said nothing. The Phase 3 deliverables are due April 14th, Brian continued. If Holt Creative attempts to assert control over the project at this stage, and it triggers a delivery delay, the province has a penalty clause, $180 per month, and the right to terminate the entire consulting agreement and reassign the contract to another firm. Another pause. Diane is the only person in Ontario who can deliver Phase 3 on time, because she's the only one who has done Phase 1 and 2. The province knows this. I spoke with their project director at 9 this morning. He was already aware of the situation. Marcus looked at Diane. The executive posture, the tight jacket, the deliberate casualness, had collapsed inward. He looked for the first time in years, like someone who needed to sit down. Brian, Marcus said, what exactly does this mean for the acquisition valuation? Brian took a long breath. Lakeview contract and associate IP represented approximately 60% of the adjusted asset value when we structured the settlement, he said. Without it, the Holt Creative acquisition it's significantly less than what you paid. Marcus closed his eyes. I need to think, he said. Don't say anything else to Diane without me present, Brian said quietly. Then the call ended. The room held its silence. Jessie was now standing very still near the windows. The casual, possessive ease she had walked in with had evaporated. She was doing the math again, Diane could tell. She was not arriving at encouraging numbers. How long, Marcus said, his voice coming out lower and older than it had any right to be. Diane waited. How long have you known this was going to happen? Diane looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, not with the vindictive energy he had perhaps prepared himself for. I didn't design this to happen to you, Marcus, she said. I designed Okafor Holdings to protect my work. I have been building under my own name since 2019, quietly, without asking you to notice, because I had learned by then that asking you to notice was an inefficient use of my time. She picked up the manila folder and returned it to the drafting table. The Lakeview contract is the most significant thing I have built in my career. I was not going to put it in a corporate structure I didn't control. That's not revenge, hunger. That's just good business. Marcus sat down. He sat down in the old swivel chair that had been Diane's studio chair for 9 years, the one with the worn armrest and the slight tilt she had never gotten fixed because she liked the angle, and he sat in it with the slow, heavy collapse of a man trying to remember something important he had forgotten. The settlement, Marcus said. I can buy the IP back. I'll pay you. Make me a number. Diane picked up her reading glasses from the top of her head and set them on the table. She looked at Marcus with the particular clarity she reserved for structural assessments. 3 weeks ago, she said, I received an offer from a real estate development group in Toronto. They want to acquire Okafor Design Holdings entirely. They want the Lakeview methodology, the heritage integration frameworks, and me as creative director on a 5-year contract. She paused. The offer is $3.1 million for the IP portfolio, plus salary, plus equity in 3 of their incoming projects. Marcus stared. I haven't signed yet, Diane continued. I was still deciding whether I wanted to go back to working inside a larger structure or build Okafor further on my own. But the offer expires on Friday. She reached for a second folder on the table. This one she opened herself and turned to face him. It was a letter, printed on the acquiring firm's letterhead. I had my lawyer send them a confirmation of exclusivity this morning. They're expecting my answer by end of business Thursday. Marcus looked at the letter. He looked at the number. Then he looked at Diane. You could have told me, he said, and he sounded, underneath everything, genuinely confused. When we were dividing everything, you could have said, I would have. You would have what? Diane asked. Her voice was steady and without heat. You would have structured the settlement differently? Retained Brian's IP expert? Made sure to list Okafor Holdings in the asset schedule. She held his gaze. I sat across from Brian's senior partner for 7 hours on a Wednesday in October, and not one of them thought to ask whether I had any registered entities in my own name. You told me, Marcus. You told me I was a designer, not a business person. You told me you were the one who understood deal structures and corporate planning. Ian, you signed exactly where your lawyers told you to sign. She closed the folder. So did I. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a room that has said everything it needed to say and is waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Jessie picked up her bag from the windowsill. She did it quietly, with the precise economy of someone who has decided something and doesn't need to announce it. She looked at Marcus. I'm going to head down, she said. Her voice was careful and neutral. I'll get a coffee or something. Marcus didn't look at her. He said, Okay, in the voice of a man who is barely in the room. Jessie crossed the studio floor without looking at Diane, pulled open the stairwell door, and went down. A minute later, through the large north windows, Diane saw her emerge from the loading dock entrance, take 3 steps onto the icy pavement, nearly lose her footing in the ankle boots, recover herself with arms out, and then walk briskly in the direction of the street. Marcus put his face in his hands. The sound he made was not dramatic. It was small and private, the kind of sound that belongs to people when they are alone, which Marcus had forgotten, for a moment, that he was not. Diane said nothing. She walked to the other end of the drafting table and began collecting her working documents. The Phase 3 schematics, the site reference photos, the heritage consultant's reports, with the methodical efficiency of someone who has been doing this work for 11 years and knows exactly where each piece goes. After a while, Marcus lifted his head. What do you need from me? He said. He was asking a practical question. He had arrived at the place men like Marcus sometimes arrive at, which is the place where the story they were telling about themselves has stopped working, and they need to know what comes next. Diane set down the Phase 3 folder and looked at him. I need the basement storage space, cleared by the end of February, she said. I have heritage materials from Phase 1 that are still boxed down there. I'll send a courier. She thought for a moment. And I need the building manager to understand that Okafor Design Holdings has ongoing site access for Lakeview documentation purposes through April 14th. You'll need to put that in writing. Marcus nodded. That's all? He asked. Diane considered him. She considered the room, her windows, her carefully cultivated northern light, brick, she had chosen to sandblast and seal, because she had looked at it one afternoon in January 7 years ago and seen what it was trying to be. That's all, she said. Marcus stood up from the old swivel chair. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his phone and the manila folder he had put down, and he walked, without swagger now, to the stairwell door. At the door he stopped. I did tell you, he said, without turning around. I told you that you didn't understand the business side. I said it 100 times. You did, Diane said. I was wrong, he said, very quietly. He opened the door. The stairwell took him. Diane listened to his footsteps descend, 3 flights, through the cold, and the exposed brick and the bare bulb work lights. Past the freight elevator she had restored by calling in a favor from a contractor in Burlington. And then she heard the loading dock door open and close. She went to the north window. She watched Marcus cross the icy lot toward the gunmetal Porsche. Jessie was not there. He stood at the car for a moment, looking at his phone. Then he got in alone. The Porsche backed out slowly, too carefully, for a man who had driven in with the certainty of a conqueror, and pulled onto the street, and was gone. The room went quiet, in the way it always went quiet, when unnecessary things left it. Diane stood at the window for a moment longer. The lake was flat and gray and enormous in the January light. There was a freighter moving across the far edge of it, slow and deliberate, in the particular way of things that have always known where they are going and have never needed to announce it. She picked up her phone. She opened her lawyer's contact. She typed, "Meeting done. Tell the firm I'll have their answer Thursday. I'm signing." Then she put the phone face down on the drafting table, sat in her old chair, tilted it to the angle she liked, and went back to work.